Okay, in these next two videos, I'm going to take you through some of the impacts that high inflation has on our living standards. So it's about all the negative impacts of high inflation. So the next two videos will look at a range of these different concepts, and these are basically all the bad things about inflation. So the first one is about the erosion of purchasing power or bracket creep. We'll talk about how it impacts international competitiveness, why it undermines economic growth, how it leads to inefficiencies in resource allocation, and some of the problems it leads for a more inequitable distribution of income, and also why higher inflation leads to higher interest rates. And there's two reasons for this. So the purpose of these next two videos is to get you, improve your understanding about all the impacts that inflation can have on each of the following things. So we'll start with the erosion of purchasing power or bracket creep. So first of all, you really got to get used to using the terms real and nominal when you're talking about incomes and interest rates and things like this. So when there's an increase in inflation, the first thing it does is it reduces people's purchasing power. There's a decline in the real value of money, which basically means that money's worth less. So $10 now is not worth as much because the average price of goods and services has increased. So any money that you're receiving from wages, rent, interest, dividends, profits, these are all forms of income. The purchasing power of any given amount of these is now less. So if inflation increases by 5%, this means we can effectively buy 5% less goods and services with the same income. The main people that suffer an erosion of purchasing power, so the main people that suffer is people that are on fixed wages, pensioners and low-skilled workers, because what that basically means is that their income doesn't generally increase in line with inflation. So they're more likely to experience less purchasing power because when prices go up, they find it a lot more difficult to increase their wages in line with inflation. And that's sort of true because pensioners aren't offering anything to the market, so they can't kind of like go on strike or anything to try and increase their wages because they're not working. Low-skilled workers, there is a greater supply of low-skilled workers, so they find it hard to increase their bargaining power and increase their wages. The main losers from inflation, self-funded retirees, so people that have got a set level of income. Those in weak unions, people in weak unions often find it hard to increase their wages or their wages when the inflation increases. Exporters suffer because when our prices go up, people don't want to buy our exports, so our international competitiveness is eroded. Ordinary families often suffer because they pay more interest on their mortgages. Don't worry too much about that for now. And the unemployed also suffer because there's an increase in unemployment for starters because more firms experience business closures because they're less competitive, but they also experience a drop in the purchasing power of their money or their cash welfare benefits. So when you're looking at inflation, basically what happens is even though generally fixed income earners will eventually be able to increase their wages, as you can see here, that blue line represents inflation, and you can see the fixed income earners take a while for their incomes to adjust. So when we're in this period here, the average prices are increasing, but their wages stayed stagnant for a long period of time, which basically means the real value of their money is not able to increase. So their increase in wages lags behind inflation, therefore they often suffer. Even if you do get a pay rise equal to inflation, so let's say you're on $100,000 and inflation increases by 8%, you could argue that if your wage was also to increase by 8%, then you've kind of adjusted for that fact. Your nominal wages increased by 8%, so you've taken out the impacts of inflation. But the problem is, even if your wage goes up by exactly the same amount as inflation, you end up paying more tax and suffering a lower real disposable income. So what I mean by that is the term bracket creep, which basically means that an increase in nominal wages to keep up with inflation. So inflation goes up by 8%, you demand a higher nominal wage by 8%. That means that people will get pushed into higher tax brackets, reducing what we call their real disposable income. And it's important that you put the word real in your answers because their disposable income will technically be higher because they'll be on a higher wage, but the real disposable income, what they can actually afford with that money, will now be less. So what I mean by that is if inflation increases by 10% and you're on $80,000 and then your wage grows from $88,000. On the surface, you're no worse off. Your wages increased by 10% and inflation has increased by 10%. But even though you've been able to negotiate for your wage to increase, you will start to now be pushed into a higher tax bracket, which means the government will collect more tax off you. So if you look at it from the first perspective, if you look at these tax brackets, if you're on $80,000, that's how much you earn for the year. What you're going to do is you're going to pay a total of $17,547 in tax. If you're on $80,000, you pay $17,547 in tax. If you start earning 88,000, you pay the 17,547, but you also pay an extra amount for everything you earn above 80,000. So you will pay 45 cents in every single dollar for what you earn above 80,000, which effectively means you're going to end up paying $20,507 in tax. So your income has gone up by 10%, but because you're getting taxed more now, your real disposable income is now less. If inflation increases by 10%, your real disposable income will fall because after tax, you now have less income in real terms because you get pushed into that higher tax bracket and you have to pay more tax on your income. So it's really important that you distinguish that even if people experience an increase in their wage and in their income by, say, 10%, they will still experience a drop in real disposable income because they get pushed into higher tax brackets. There are people that gain from inflation. Those in strong unions benefit from inflation because they're generally able to increase their wages by more than inflation. There are also other people that invest in certain assets, and we'll talk about that a bit more in the next video, that can actually increase their value higher than inflation. And those lenders offering variable interest rates will generally increase during times of inflation. They can also benefit as well. We'll talk about this in the next video.